Let me start by introducing myself. I'm Juliet Bender, and I'm the Vice President of the Lane County Master Gardener Association Board. And I'd like to welcome you tonight to our monthly seminar series, which we hold a third Tuesday of every month at 6:30. This talk will be recorded, so we will post it online. So if you want to listen to it again or have a friend that might want to listen to it, it will be available online. And there will be time at the end for questions. So if you do have questions, put those in the Q&A box on the screen. And we will get to those at the end. I also want to make an announcement that this webinar has been accepted for 1 CEU credit hour with the Oregon Landscape Contractors Board. So participants must register and attend the live event to receive the Oregon Landscape credit. Jet will put in the chat box the email that you need to contact her at for a digital copy of this certificate. So that will appear in the chat box if you need to get such a certificate and get that credit hour. Also in the Zoom invitation at the bottom, there was a handout for this lecture. So it's a 2-page front and back handout, 2-page handout. So I think those are all the announcements. So let me introduce Neil Bell, who is joining us this evening. Neil is a community horticulturist for the OSU Extension Service in Marion and Polk counties. Since 2000, he has overseen master gardener programs in both counties. He also helps coordinate the Northwest Plant Evaluations, a research program that evaluates plants for unirrigated landscapes in the Willamette Valley. So let me turn it over to Neil, and you can bring up your PowerPoint.
Hi, everybody. I hope everyone can see that. And I'd like to thank Juliet for that nice introduction, and also Sharon and Jet for the invitation to speak and for organizing the seminar series. It's wonderful. So it's a pleasure to be part of that. I was asked to do a presentation on landscaping without the use of irrigation in the Willamette Valley. So that's the topic of today's presentation. I have lots and lots of slides, so I'm going to speak as quickly as I can and still be intelligible over the course of the next 40 or 45 minutes. So what I have, there we go. The outline of the presentation is, first of all, why one would choose to develop a landscape without considering irrigation. And then also a consideration of the climate in Western Oregon and the challenges that that poses for doing so. And then if you go down this road, evaluating your sites for any challenges that you might want to deal with prior to or during the process of developing the landscape. And then lastly, basically the last half of this presentation is really just a sort of annotated list of plants which work well in a unirrigated landscape in the Willamette Valley. So it's not intended to be comprehensive by any stretch of the imagination. It's what I could cram into the presentation once I was done talking about some of these principles. So I took this from this is actually from the Polk County Itemizer Observer, our weekly newspaper, which is still going strong. And this is an article from way back around 2003 when the newspaper was pondering the fact that the county was already assuming that certain communities would start to become water limited as the years went on. And that was a few years ago. So, I mean, water is not a given, and water shortages can occur, and water can be expensive in some of these communities as well, not probably related to the relative availability. So why develop a landscape without water? I mean, why would you choose to do that? A number of reasons, one of which is you may not, as we did not, really have enough water to consider irrigating your landscape as well as providing water to your house. You may choose to save on the cost of water because sometimes it can be quite spendy. You also save on the cost of an irrigation system should you choose to put something like that in. Or you just like the characteristics of some drought-tolerant plants and want to develop a landscape around those. And then lastly, and I'll go into a little more detail about this, you may reduce your summer weed problems. What I should say is you will alter your summer weed problems, which is probably a better way to put it, but certainly you'll reduce certain weeds and may not reduce certain others. So this is our landscape. I mean, to answer the question, why would you choose to develop a landscape without irrigation? This is our house. We bought our property. This is west of Monmouth at about 600 feet. And so it's acreage out there. And there was, like all the properties out there, most of them are on a well. There is a water co-op available, which we eventually hooked up to. But for the first 12 years, our landscape developed without irrigation. And so it was just necessary to develop the landscape that way because there was really only enough water in the well, especially as summer went on, to supply the house. So that's one part of our landscape, and this is another part. This is early in the growing season, so the grass is still green. It is allowed to go brown without irrigation. But as you can see, even without the use of irrigation, one can still have a pretty lush landscape. The water that we have, courtesy of the hookup to Lucky Mute Water Co-op about 12 years ago, the well has now gone on to its second life as an irrigation source for the orchard that we have, and also for the vegetable garden. And both of these things I know one can do also without irrigating, as per the dry farming project at OSU. Well, we have the water from the well, so we go ahead and irrigate the vegetable garden. But most of the landscape is still unirrigated, even with this change. So I had a personal interest in the topic, and I'm not sure which is which, the chicken or the egg, but this also led to a professional interest in evaluating landscape plants, as Juliette mentioned, through this little program we have called Northwest Plant Evaluations. And there's actually information on the web for all the completed trials, and we're working on the most recent one, under Northwest Plant Evaluations, which is a tab on the Horticulture Department website. So essentially what these are we would gather as many cultivars of a given genus as we can. This is Ceanothus, and then plant them out in a landscape situation and see how they did over a number of years, without irrigation, without fertilization, without pruning, and without pest management sprays, I guess you would say. So it was a sort of a survival of the fittest regime, I suppose you could say. And this shows the Ceanothus evaluation, which was up at the Oregon Garden from 2001 to 2005. We did others. This is a rock rose evaluation. And the rest of these have all been up at Aurora at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center, which is OSU's research station in Aurora. So this is an evaluation of about 90 different cultivars of rock rose, which all seem to bloom at the same time, as you can see. And then the most recent one was an evaluation of Manzanitas, which took place at Aurora between 2011 and 2019. So I'll talk a little bit about some of all these plants when I'm discussing drought-tolerant plants. The most recent evaluation that we have is, again, up in Aurora at North Willamette, and it's a evaluation of ground cover. So we've moved away from the idea of doing a genus and then just sort of this potpourri of different ground covers for drought-tolerant landscapes. But the principles have all been the same: no pruning, no watering, no fertilizing, and see what happens. And of course, what the goal is to see what tolerates lack of summer irrigation, but also cold hardiness, because some members of these genera lack hardiness for the Willamette Valley. So we have a range of goals here: hardiness, drought tolerance, flowering evaluations, and also any pest or disease issues. So that's kind of the sort of personal interest. And I mentioned there are also weeds. I mean, you may reduce your summer weed problems in addition to eliminating the need to buy water or pay for an irrigation system. Weeds are kind of an interesting thing in that they're very adaptable. And here is a planting actually of looks like vine maple and a cistus, or a rock rose, which is possibly not being irrigated. But notice that there is an abundance of broadleafed and grassy weeds in the plot as well. So your weeds will not go away when you stop irrigating. And some weeds are just very, very drought tolerant, as drought tolerant as any of the landscape plants that you would choose to put in there. So here we have a nice combination, if you like, of California poppy and of course Queen Anne's lace. So this is a very, very drought tolerant plant. The other thing that you will need to deal with is winter annual weeds, because like it or not, the lack of irrigation in summer may deter some summer annual weeds, but it will do nothing in our climate to deter winter annual weeds. And this shows one of our Manzanitas, which has a very open habit, wasn't a very good plant at suppressing weeds, as some of them turned out to be. So this mess of grassy and broadleaf weeds is occurring in the winter underneath this plant because moisture is abundant. And when moisture is abundant, your weed problems will persist. So the other thing to be aware of is bare soil. Bare soil is an open invitation to weeds anywhere, and especially in the Willamette Valley where moisture is relatively abundant. So the soil needs to be covered up with something in order to suppress weeds. And the other problem you will find is that perennial weeds are not the slightest bit deterred by lack of summer irrigation, and one of those is field bindweed here, a photo I took in Polk County. So perennial weeds really do need to be tackled before you consider planting or repurposing your landscape, so to speak. So yes, the soil should be covered with something. Organic mulches are often a popular use or a popular way of suppressing temporarily, of course. Weeds of various kinds, mostly those which are annual, in that it prevents germination of seeds. My preference, though, as you may have noticed from the previous photographs, is to cover up the soil with as much foliage, desirable foliage, I guess you could say, as possible. And so that is my strategy for weed management in our landscape, and it's largely successful. The larger, the denser, the more evergreen the plant is, then the larger the range of weeds which it will successfully suppress. Okay, so just a caveat, I guess you could say, about weeds in the landscape. Yes, you will suppress some of those summer annual weeds which need water to thrive, but there's a lot of other weeds out there which are quite drought tolerant. The good news is many of them are pretty diminutive and easily suppressed with either a mulch layer or preferably plants. So I took this from a book on the various Mediterranean climates in the world. And they're kind of an interesting and very limited climate as climates throughout the world go, occupying only about 2% of the world's landmass. And interestingly enough, located in both the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere, on the west-facing side of continents between about 30 and 45 degrees. That's the classic Mediterranean climate. And as you can see in North America, it includes only California. It doesn't even include the Rogue Valley of Southern Oregon, which is considered to be a true Mediterranean climate. But the reality is that even though Oregon isn't like this, this is in Southern California at Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, which is well worth a visit if you're in Claremont, we have what amounts to a temperate Mediterranean climate. So the characteristics of a Mediterranean climate are that there are mild, wet winters and warm to hot, dry summers. So as you can see in this graph, this is from Salem, the mean annual temperature throughout the year doesn't drop below 0 Celsius. But look at that change in rainfall from winter into the middle of summer and then back into fall and winter again. So there's this pronounced deficit of irrigation from the sky, so to speak, as the year goes into June, July, August, September. And then as the fall comes on, it starts to rain again. So there's this deficit of rainfall during those summer months when it's warmest, which will stress a lot of plants that are not adapted to that type of pattern from various areas of the world. So that's what we deal with. And that's one of the major limitations to growing plants without irrigation in the Willamette Valley. The plants one grows needs to be adapted to the climate conditions that prevail here. So here's a picture I took, this is years ago, in Dallas, and this home was being sold, but apparently had been abandoned, and the picture was taken in midsummer. And notice some of the plants are tolerating this lack of irrigation, which is obvious from the color of the lawn, better than others. So plant choice is key when it comes to maintaining a healthy and aesthetically pleasing irrigation-free landscape. And here's another one. This is in Corvallis. This is outside the hospital, as a matter of fact. And here's Ceanothus gloriosus, a very drought-tolerant California native of Ceanothus. And this is kinnikinic. And we'll talk more about kinnikinic because kinnikinic varies greatly in drought tolerance. And you can see here, it's chlorotic, but also parts of it have actually died out. And I suspect the reason why is because it's not a West Coast form of kinnikinic, which is dispersed widely throughout the Northern Hemisphere. Other plants are faring better than others. This is winged euonymus, and I think this is some sort of holly. So again, the tolerance of various plants for a summer drought in our climate is just really all over the board. I took this picture in Corvallis, in winter one year, actually a couple of years ago, and noticed the arborvitae have almost died as a result of drought stress from the previous summer, whereas English laurel, which is, you probably are aware, is a little bit weedy, but is being used here as a sort of a spreading ground cover, isn't affected at all because it's from South Central Europe and adapted to those periods of summer drought, which arborvitae, being from Eastern North America, is not. So plant choice matters. This poor pair of rhododendrons was in a landscape in Salem I took a few years ago, and just not a plant well adapted to prolonged drought in the summer. And then the other factor, because we are not a Mediterranean climate in the true sense, is cold. So in addition to being tolerant of the summer drought without irrigating, plants also have to be sufficiently cold hardy to be grown in our climate because we occasionally get very cold. Case in point, this is we also did a grevillea trial way back in the day, and that lasted not as long as some of the other ones because most of the grevilleas, which are Australian in origin, did not turn out to be hardy enough for landscape use. And I had high hopes for this one. This is Grevillea lanigera coastal gem, December and January flowering plant, as many of these are, so very desirable for that characteristic. So this is a picture taken in November, and this is a picture taken a few weeks later after the cold had finished it off. So yeah, the plant has to be hardy enough to be used in the landscape. With some of these things, you can broaden the palette of plants that you grow simply by putting tender things or things that you want to water into containers. And of course, once you put anything into a container, then it's by definition almost no longer tolerant of drought. It will need regular irrigation, but at least you're only irrigating a small area. So we do this extensively on the patio at our place, putting in things that are either tender and require protection in the winter, or things that are just going to need too much water to do well in the landscape. So we just concentrate them here on the patio where they're more easily watered. So there are ways to have both irrigated and non-irrigated parts of the landscape. It's just a matter of clustering them where it's convenient to keep them watered. So plant selection matters greatly, but there's other things one can do to ensure a good result, if you like, of the plant choices, as well as possibly broaden the palette of things that can be grown to include things that aren't classically thought of as being drought tolerant. So first thing is full sun or some shade. Full sun, of course, is maximum stress. So if the site being considered for a drought tolerant landscape is in full sun, then one will need to consider more drought tolerant plants. And so you can see this is a planting in Salem, the cotoneasters, these western red cedar. I mean, I don't know what they were thinking, but everything is suffering here in this photo I took one year. I think it was in August. But if you have some afternoon shade, then you can successfully grow some things which are not really fully drought tolerant, because that shade will relieve the stress on the plant later in the afternoon when it's hottest and when the stress on it would otherwise be at its greatest. I'm not saying all of these things are great candidates for un-irrigation. I'm just saying that shade, and this is the afternoon, will provide you with a little added flexibility in what you choose to plant. Be aware that what is providing the shade makes a big difference. If you have enormous old Douglas fir or other large plants like this providing the shade, yes, they will shade the landscape, but they're also very, very thirsty plants. And so these siphon water right out of the soil and are really challenging to get a landscape established under if you're starting from scratch, so to speak. So this will be challenging. And this is part of what we faced when we started developing our landscape. The site aspect matters as well. So any west or south facing aspect will be that much warmer than one which faces east or one which faces north. If there are any heat radiating structures like this brick wall we have here, this is in Corvallis, they have vine maple, they have rhododendron, and it's just being cooked by the tremendous heat billowing off this, this wall. So that's one thing to be aware of, is that that those types of things will add to the stress of any plants put next to them, especially if that's a west or south facing wall. And then, of course, there is soil quality, which is so important to the success of any landscape, and that includes these types of landscapes where oftentimes drainage is something that a lot of these plants are going to need. So this is often an issue, particularly in newer construction, just because of the disturbance of the soil and the compaction of the soil that occurs during the process of building. So compaction is the thing actually that I think is the most worrisome. So that really should be addressed before the landscape is established. So this particular little area out front of this house was just rock hard. We actually did some soil sampling in these types of situations, and it's not even so much the quality of the soil, you know, the pH or the nutrient content. It's really compaction that is going to be the most challenging aspect to establishing a landscape. So you must do what you must do to break up this material. And I will tell you that a rototiller is not the tool I have in mind. It really needs to be broken up prior to the incorporation of any organic matter. Otherwise, you might end up with a situation like this. This is in Monmouth in a little landscape that I helped the city with. And the RV that you see here was parked by the homeowner on this city-owned property, which is part of the park for many years, in the process compacting the soil beyond belief. So in order to get these things in the ground, and this was not my preferred way of doing it, they actually had to get this two-person auger to drill the holes for the plant. So this is by no means ideal. And the sins of this landscape installation were covered up by a copious layer of bark dust. So anyway, it's done actually fairly well, but I'm saying there are better ways. This may be excessive, but this might be one way of breaking up soil compaction at the same time as digging in organic matter. If you're not blessed with a machine like that, well, by golly, hopefully it's okay and the soil quality is such that you're able to dig in some organic matter just to give everything a little bit of a boost early on. You don't need to do a lot of this, but breaking up that soil in order to provide a better rooting environment is critical. One other thing on soil is you can buy a sand mix or a sand, basically. It is sand as topsoil in the Willamette Valley. And there's a couple of reasons to be wary of doing this unless your soil is so hopeless that you have no alternative. One is that texturally it's going to be completely different from what is present in most sites in the Willamette Valley, which is going to be a sort of a clay soil. And this is sand. So texturally and hydrologically, it's a very different thing. But oftentimes what you see is this being spread out on top of a clay, often a compacted clay soil, and then the landscape is put in after that. And so you can see by the color of this lawn that it's very, very hungry. There's very little in the way of nitrogen in that mix. And so what you end up with is sort of on a nitrogen treadmill, as well as potentially introducing some undesirable weeds, like as in this case, horsetail, which was brought in with that product. The other thing is placing sand over top of clay creates a kind of perched water table. And this is a turf installation in South Salem. And the turf is extremely thin, partly because of these large fir trees, which is partly shading it, but also because this is a clay layer overladen by a sand layer, and then this organic material above that. So the water is soaking into the organic layer and the sand layer, but not moving into the clay, creating this extremely wet environment at the soil surface. So that is not good for turf. It's also not good for most landscape plants, including most of the ones that we'll discuss. So any soil-related issues should be addressed prior to planting. There are also potential drainage issues associated with certain landscape sites. Again, this is not a drought-tolerant planting. It's a planting which is rectangular and just boxed in by the wall on one side and then the sidewalk on the other. And so when it rains, and especially in the winter, water tends to pool here. And I think you can tell by the condition of the Daphne in the foreground that it's just not thriving at all. And so these types of situations need to be addressed with tiling or other means prior to the installation of your new landscape. Not a good situation at all. So those are just some things to be aware of when we are thinking about developing a landscape or repurposing a landscape to those which are a landscape which will not receive irrigation. So at this point, we will transition to a discussion of what some of those plants might be. And I provide a definition of what a drought-tolerant plant is. And that is a plant which, after a short establishment period, will grow and flower normally without supplemental irrigation. So a couple of things about that is a short establishment period, ideally, is you plant in the fall. And by doing so, you can water the plants for a few days or weeks or whatever it happens to be until the rains in the fall begin reliably and the soil remains damp enough for the plant to continue growing. So that's ideal. The later that planting process is delayed, then the more likely it is that you're going to have to provide some summer water just to get the plant through its first year. The other thing is that the plant will grow and flower normally, but that doesn't necessarily mean it won't show some stress. As we'll see, some of these very drought-tolerant plants do show stress in ways that take a little bit of getting used to. But all of them have ways of managing lack of water in the soil. And so those strategies vary from plant to plant, but stress reactions may be part of that. But the point is, they'll show that stress, they'll still grow, they'll still flower normally. So they'll do what you're looking for that landscape to do. So the rest of the presentation, I hope I'm on time, consists of as I mentioned, annotated list of those things which will grow without summer irrigation, starting, say, in January, and then as we go on through December. So you can have interest, floral interest, throughout the year. So of course, that includes many of our native plants. It includes shrubs and bulbs and perennials. And I focus mostly on woodies during this presentation, so just because there's so many of them out there. And, you can get things like cactus, which are, thought of being the ultimate drought-tolerant plant, although many cactus are native to areas which receive a fair amount of summer irrigation in the form of monsoons. And actually prefer drier conditions in the winter. But one can make a go of it with these things, but I'm just not going to focus on that particular group of plants. And I also will not discuss conifers, not because I don't like many of those. I just chose to focus on broadleaf flowering plants. Of course, many of these types of plants, the conifers, with time are fully drought tolerant in our climate and also provide a lot of foliar interest throughout the year, and especially in the wintertime. The one other thing to keep in mind is turf. One can grow a lawn without irrigation in the Willamette Valley. This is our lawn, which is allowed to go dormant each year. We have learned that, especially in the last 5 years or so, that as the summers seem to have become warmer and drier, the turf does not respond as well in the fall and has a tendency to show patchy die out. So some of the lawn is actually dying as a result of lack of water. And so what we do now is we just put a sprinkler on it to water it every couple of weeks or so, just to keep those crowns alive. We don't keep it green, it's still brown, but by doing so, we preserve more of the lawn and allow it to recover when the rains start again in October or so. So when you're choosing native plants, the thing to keep in mind is, of course, you want to choose native plants from a dry environment. Thimbleberry would not be an ideal choice for a drought-tolerant landscape because where you see it occurring, of course, is where the moisture tends to be relatively abundant, as you see here. What you'll be looking for is native plants which are accustomed to a period of prolonged summer drought, such as these ocean spray and associated plants in this little forested situation here. And then, of course, there's perennial plants, some of which are ephemeral. You know, they will go completely dormant in the summer. And by doing so, of course, that's the way they survive, as do our native annual plants as well. So without further ado, starting in January, this is actually a fairly rarely seen silk tassel species. This is Garria fremontii. Garria is a genus which also includes the more commonly known Garria elliptica, which occurs on the Oregon coast and down south into California. Fremontii has a wider distribution into southern Oregon, actually into the Cascades. So it's just that much farther away from the coast, and also exhibits a little bit more drought tolerance. But they're large evergreen shrubs. You have to have space for this thing. It'll begin blooming in January. Like many winter blooming plants, it'll bloom for a long period of time. It has these dangly clusters of flowers. So it's a very textural plant. I've never detected any scent or seen a lot of insect activity on them. But if you have room, it provides something that not really any other native plant or landscape plant can give you in that sort of textural sense during the middle of winter. This is chaparral currant, which is a native of Northern California, and it is native. It's native up into, oh, I'm not sure exactly how far north. I don't believe it actually occurs in Oregon, but it is a relative of the flowering currant, which of course also occurs in the same range and then way up into British Columbia. So this is a semi-evergreen shrub. As you can see, it's about 8 to 10 feet tall, and depending on how you prune it, about as wide. But the cool thing about this is it begins blooming after Thanksgiving and will continue in bloom. Really, the one in our garden is behind me as I speak, and it's still in what amounts to full bloom now. So it has this extremely long bloom period. It will bloom throughout snow and ice, as it did. We had ice. And then so on those warm days in the winter, it's very attractive to hummingbirds that are overwintering, as well as any insects that are foraging during warm days in the dead of winter. One thing you have to get used to is this is a very aromatic California native, and it manages drought by going dormant in the summertime. So it will literally drop almost all its leaves until it starts to rain in the fall, and then it leaves out again. And as I mentioned, it's very aromatic, and the bloom period is extremely long. So if you had only one overwintering or winter blooming plant in your garden, this might be the one to grow. Then there are these various bulbs, which are ephemeral, and so they go dormant in the summertime and avoid drought in the summer simply by being dormant. So snowdrops, of course, which are in full bloom now, crocus of various kinds. I mean, there's just so many of these things. There's no end to it, really. And of course, every garden has space, if not in the ground, at least in pots for all of these. And then also daffodils, which are, you could have an entire presentation just on the huge range of daffodils that are out there. This is a contorted hazel, which again is in bloom in January, February. This is one entitled Red Majestic. There are now cultivars which are Eastern filbert blight resistant from OSU, the same breeding program that produced the hazelnut, which are being planted for the same reason, being filbert blight resistant. This is one called Red Majestic. The one from OSU is Red Dragon, and it is EFB resistant. I don't have a good picture of Red Dragon, so I use this one. But the effect is more or less the same, a contorted filbert with these red catkins during the wintertime. So again, texturally a very interesting plant. Most of us associate clematis with spring, summer, and fall. There is also a Mediterranean species, Clematis Serosa, which is the winter flowering clematis, which will also go partly dormant during the summertime. This is one in our garden growing on a very inadequate little metal trellis. And as you can see, it's making itself at home in the plant next door. But it will bloom, and it is in bloom right now. So it's got a long bloom period, as do so many of these winter blooming ornamentals. So really cute little vine. This is a vine, of course, as are many clematis. So if you have space for something like this, this photo was taken at the Rogerson Clematis collection in Lake Oswego. And so there's a number of other of these Clematis Serosa cultivars. This is one called Clematis Serosa variety Purpurea freckles for the spots on the petals themselves. So a vine, if you've got space for a vine, this is a really, really delightful little addition to the winter garden. And then other bulbs, including these reticulated type irises, one of the earliest irises to bloom. So a sort of a bulbous iris, this one called Iris histrioides with these bright purple flowers, which again will go summer dormant. One of the plants put into the chat box was sweet box, and it might be one of the most commonly planted winter blooming, fragrant winter blooming ornamental plants, particularly useful for shade. So this is often where you see planted because it's really quite intolerant of sun, where it will tend to go chlorotic. But the most common ones are Sarcococca confusa and Sarcococca hookeriana, and this just shows the flowers, which are, you know, relatively showy of sweet box, but it's a nice evergreen shrub, about 3 to 4 feet tall and just as wide or maybe a little wider. So both of these hookeriana and confusa are variations on a theme. Both are very fragrant and have a long bloom period, as do so many winter blooming plants. This is, strictly speaking, another herbaceous perennial, but it looks for all the world like a small shrub. Hellebores, this one is Corsican hellebore, as the name suggests, from the Mediterranean region. So it has these green clusters of flowers right now in February, March, and evergreen foliage. You prune off these flowers when they're done in order to prevent the plant from seeding, which it will do politely. So once you have one of these, you usually end up with a cluster of them. But the foliage is nice, the flowers are interesting, and they light up the winter garden. Manzanitas, of course, I'm sure most of you are familiar with these. We did a trial of these of various kinds. Manzanitas are a large genus of Western North American plants, and they also include kinnikinic, which is a circumpolar species in both Asia and Europe and North America. These plants range in size from tree-like shrubs like this one down to very diminutive ground covers like this form of Arctostaphylous numbularia or kinnikinic. Many of them have this amazing bark, the shrub forms do in any case, which are ornamental in themselves. They bloom in these clusters of bell-shaped flowers. This is in the heath family. So again, in many cases, they're winter blooming and they will attract insects during the dead of winter. And then in some cases, not all, but many cases, they will all produce the characteristic little apple or manzanita, which gives the whole common name to the genus. These are native all over the West. So this is Crater Lake. This is probably greenleaf manzanita or Arctostaphylous patula growing up there and literally growing on nothing, volcanic tuff in Southern Oregon. In our area, that is in Western Oregon, we have a couple of common ones. This is Arctostaphylous numbularia growing at the beach. So if you're going to choose one of these Arctostaphylous numbularia or kinnikinic cultivars, I'd really encourage you to select one which is native to the West. Because in our trials, the one plant in the entire Manzanita trial which showed drought stress was actually the kinnikinic cultivar called Massachusetts, which, as the name suggests, is selected from seed from Massachusetts, which is a summer rainfall climate. So it was just not well suited to growing without irrigation in the Willamette Valley. But there are lots of West Coast derived cultivars of kinnikinic. And then the other native manzanita in our region is Arctostaphylous columbiana, or the hairy manzanita. In this case, I'm showing it out in the gorge, which is a larger rounded evergreen shrub. Amongst the ones that we had in our trial, the bloom period varied greatly from January 1st, I guess you could say, into the middle of April or so. This is a large evergreen shrub. This is about 8 feet by 8 feet, called Sentinel. Pink flowers, very heavy bloomer. These are really attractive to hummingbirds during the wintertime. So it's got, again, like winter blooming plants, it's got a long bloom period. So Sentinel is a good winter blooming form. And here's another one, which is a more shrubby spreading form called Austin Griffiths. And both of these are hardy and successful in this area. And again, tolerating even snow when in bloom. So a pretty tough plant. But the size, as I mentioned, is all over the board. So if you're looking for something a little bit smaller, this one fared well in our evaluation. It's what's called select form. It's Arctostaphylous Numbularia. So it just forms a nice little evergreen bun about 2 feet tall and 3 to 4 feet across. And if you're looking for something a little bit bigger, there's several forms of Arctostaphylous hookeri. This is just one called Wayside, which over the course of about 7 years, this is after about 7 years after planting, it formed a plant about 5 feet tall and about 10 or 11 feet wide. So if you're looking for a big scale ground cover, you can do worse than plants like this. Of course, Oregon grape will be in bloom soon. This is our native evergreen shrub, growing to about 6 to 8 feet tall and about 5 to 6 feet across, and producing ultimately those edible fruit. There are smaller forms of Oregon grape out there. This is one called Apollo, which forms a much more diminutive shrub to only about 2.5 feet tall and maybe 3 feet wide, but with the same yellow blooms. And I think there's some opportunities for selection of better cultivars of all of our native plants really out there if you just keep your eyes open. This is near Mosier at the trailhead for the Mosier Plateau, as a matter of fact. And it's just a form that I thought was amazing of our Oregon grape, which I took a photo of out in the gorge, presumably with even greater drought tolerance than some of the ones in the Willamette Valley, just because the heat load it would endure during the summer. So there's some selection opportunities out there. One of the first native plants to bloom, woody native plants to bloom, I should say, at least one of the first drought-tolerant woody plants, just blooming a little bit after some of our willows, is osoberry, which is a upright growing deciduous shrub, which can get, depending on the situation, to about 8 or 10 feet tall and wide. So this one is in full sun and it's blooming heavily with these nice attractive white blooms. So generally by the beginning of March, it's in bloom. And then of course it'll produce the namesake fruit, which turn blue when they're ripe, and which you'd have to, if you're planning on harvesting these because they're edible, you will have to net these plants because the birds will take every single one as soon as it's, even before it turns blue. Rosemary was mentioned in the chat box as a drought tolerant plant. Of course, these are Mediterranean evergreen shrubs. So of course, fully drought tolerant in the Willamette Valley. It's undergone a name change, by the way, from Rosemarinus officinalis to Salvia. It's now a Salvia, Salvia rosemarinus. But so many selected forms out there. I mean, you could have an entire presentation on rosemary, on all the variations. A long bloom period depending on the cultivar you select. So you get variations in size, you get variations in bloom time, you get variations in bloom color. Aromatic evergreen shrubs, though, in each and every case. So this shows a white bloom one called ARP up at our drought tolerant planting at the Oregon Garden. The other thing to keep in mind is these also are ground covery. There's a number of trailing forms which make good ground covers. The one thing to be aware of is that these tend to be more tender than most of the upright forms, but just as aromatic. Currants and gooseberries. Oregon is a center of diversity for currants, especially Southern Oregon. So in the genus Ribes, you know, the most commonly grown one, I guess, as an ornamental is going to be flowering currant, of which there's a great number of cultivars. There's these pink ones. There might be one called Pokey's Pink. There are white ones as well, Hanneman's White, as well as the one which was developed at OSU called Oregon Snowflake by the woody plant breeder Ryan Contreras in the horticulture department. And then of course there's the bright red forms. This is one called Vampire, which is down at Dancing Oaks Nursery. So there's other red ones like King Edward VII and Elk River, which is another form from southwestern Oregon. Tall evergreen plants, which are just the hummingbirds go crazy over. They'll also go crazy over some of these other types. This is a gooseberry from Oregon. And so this is characteristic, some of the types of plants which are also in the genus Ribes in Oregon. And this is a form from Polk County of Ribes lobbii, or gummy gooseberry. But there's so many of these throughout Western and Southern Oregon that has these sort of fuchsia flower type effect. So very different from the flowering currant, but again, really popular with pollinators and also with hummingbirds. Back to bulbs, so in May, late April, May, Camas are in bloom in the Willamette Valley. This, by the way, is one of the horticultural wonders of Western Oregon. This is a Camas Prairie, which happens to be also double as the parking lot for the Oregon State Fairgrounds off of Sunny View Road. This is a parking lot during August and September. But in April and May, it's a Camas Prairie, so it's kind of cool. So yeah, beautiful bulbs native to Western and Southern Oregon. If you got lots of space too, by the way, you can plant serviceberry. This is a large deciduous evergreen shrub with a characteristic white flowers, pardon me, in the rose family. So a very pretty shrub in bloom with attractive foliage, and then producing namesake fruit, which varies greatly in palatability, in my opinion, from not very palatable to being very delicious. Just depends on the individual clone. So as we move into summer, then there's lots of different forms of thyme. Of course, these are very popular with various pollinators, bumblebees and honeybees. And there's, of course, it's a huge genus with many forms. I prefer the taller forms for the weed suppression that they provide, like this Thymus vulgaris. So very aromatic as well. Evergreen shrubs. Lots of rock roses. I mean, again, it's a huge genus with many, many different representatives. The most commonly grown of which are Cystis hybridus, pictured here, an evergreen shrub to 4 to 5 feet tall and 6 to 8 feet across. The other common one that you will see of similar or greater size is Cystis purpureus, with these purple flowers with the dot at the base of each petal. And then there are smaller ones. Again, these range in size and habit considerably. This is one called Cystis pulverulentus sunset, which is much more diminutive and actually has one of the longer bloom periods of all of the rock roses. And then a related genus is Helianthemum, which is distinguished by the fact that it's got a silvery foliage, and often some of these will have yellow flowers, which Cystis do not. This one is a cultivar called Sandling, which has these yellow flowers with a little brown dot at the base of each petal. Very cute and very long flowering in April and May into June. And then another related genus to these are the sun roses, with the most commonly grown of these is Helianthemum Nomularium. And this just shows one cultivar called Belgravia rose, which has these rose-colored flowers. There are lots of other cultivars of these, which again are much more diminutive plants, usually only growing to about 18 inches tall and maybe 2 feet to 3 feet across. So much better for smaller spaces than either the Helianthemum even, or certainly most of the Cystis. Spanish lavender, one of the earliest lavenders to bloom, very popular again, like all lavenders are, with bumblebees. Evergreen aromatic shrub, purple leaves, purple flowers, I should say, in May and June. And then California lilac, that was mentioned in the chat box. And again, just an amazing range of species and cultivars of this particular plant. Again, native primarily to the West Coast, but there are also some Midwest and East Coast ceanothus, which have provided opportunities for breeding programs, which we'll talk very briefly about. This is one of the native ceanothus. This is on Highway 99W, north of Adair Village, north of Corvallis, and it's buckbrush, which you see in en masse, if you like, in the Klamath Mountains. But it does range as far north as the Willamette Valley. And so it's a white flowered evergreen gray leaved shrub, which blooms in May. So, and this is a native ceanothus. But the most commonly seen ones are those which are introduced from California, this one being Ceanothus therziflorus victoria, a very large evergreen shrub with blue flowers in late April and May. And then the very opposite, this is Ceanothus gloriosus, which is utilized as a ground cover, but again has blue flowers around the same time of the year. So very different in habit. Evergreen plants, they're nitrogen fixing in many cases, which means that they basically make their own nitrogen fertilizer, so can survive on soils which are otherwise deficient in nitrogen. There are many others. This is one of the earliest ceanothus to bloom. This is one called Blue Jeans. We have one in our garden, and it is just barely beginning to bloom now. But a large evergreen shrub, count on this thing being 8 feet tall and just as least as wide. A little bit smaller is this one called Tilden Park. Again, this one blooms maybe in May or so, reaching about 4 to 5 feet and about 6 to 8 feet in width. They're not for the small garden necessarily. If you like something a little bit later, this is one of the hybrid ceanothus that I mentioned, a hybrid between the eastern and western species of ceanothus. This is one called Gloar De Versailles. It's a cultivar of Ceanothus delilianus. And because it blooms on new wood, it will bloom later, so from June into July, and a somewhat smaller plant, especially if it's pruned. Carpet brooms, if you're looking for If you're looking for a ground cover, these brooms are not weedy, like of course Scotch broom is known to be. So this is in a different genus as well. This is Genista. There are two commonly grown forms, Genista lydia, and then this is Genista Pylosa. Almost indistinguishable in bloom, and also I would say one of the shortest blooming broadleaf plants you can put in your garden. Only have a bloom period of about 5 days, but they do have a good ground covering capability. And again, being a legume, also nitrogen fixing. Roses of various kinds. Of course, any native rose is going to be fully drought tolerant in the Willamette Valley. This shows Rosa nutkana in a hedgerow. So just one of the 3 or so main native roses here. And then old roses as well. Hybrid tea and other roses that bloom on new wood, I would not encourage planting because they do bloom on new wood. They do prefer some summer irrigation in order to keep growing and blooming, but the old roses are very tough. Just be aware that many of them also sucker, as do our native roses. So they need to be placed where that suckering can occur without it being a problem. This is a rose we grow in our garden. This is called Eddie's Jewel. This is not a climber, it's a freestanding rose, but it's just huge and has this gigantic V shape or vase shape when it's in bloom with these non-scented red flowers. So quite a statement in the garden. And then back to natives again, ocean spray, one of the nicest deciduous flowering shrubs for the garden. This is all over the Willamette Valley and comes into bloom in June and into July. Very tall, not a lot of selection that I've seen on this particular plant, but maybe there are opportunities out there for dwarfer forms and maybe some color variation as well, because most of them tend to have these clusters of cream colored flowers. And then into midsummer, lavenders, of course, again, it's one of those genera which there's no time to cover whatsoever. This is just one example. These plants, by the way, are just so attractive to bumblebees in particular. The plants will just be alive with the sound of bumblebees in mid to summer and then into August. Same with other plants like sage. These are true Mediterraneans. This is Salvia Fisnalis, the true sage. Of course, that genus, Salvia, has many, many Western North American representatives, some of which are a little bit tender, but also are very aromatic. So great plants for the landscape, both for flower and also for that aromatic capability. There's another form of this called Salvia Fisnalis purpurea with the purple foliage. And then again, back to native plants, snowberry, a ubiquitous plant of understory throughout the woods in Western Oregon, a deciduous suckering shrub, which produces the namesake white berries, but also has one of the longest bloom periods of a native plant because it blooms, again, on new wood. So it's producing fruit here, as you can see, while it's still flowering. So it's got a long bloom period. And again, it's very attractive to native pollinators, especially bumblebees, which will hang off these flowers in the process of pollinating. So a very cool mid to late summer blooming native plant. And then into August and September, here's another option for you if you've got room. Chase tree, Vitex agnus castus, which has these pikes of blue flowers, or in some cases pink, or I think there's even white forms of this. And some breeding work being done to make them smaller because these are large deciduous shrubs, which this one will probably eventually get to be 12 feet tall and wide. So again, not for the small garden, but a super pollinator plant, which will just be covered with pollinators in late summer. California fuchsia was mentioned. This does range into Oregon, by the way, Southern Oregon. So there are Oregon forms of this, not in the Willamette Valley, but in Southern Oregon. So Epilobium Kanem, the California fuchsia, a sparely suckering herbaceous woody plant. It's really a subshrub, is I guess what you call it. Red flowers in this sort of tubular form, which are the hummingbirds and bumblebees go crazy over, and often this silvery foliage as well, which contrasts well and really gives it an effect that nothing else will. So it's kind of a politely suckering little ground cover, I guess you could say. And here it's being used as a mix with other plants like Manzanita and also with lavender in this drought-tolerant planting up at the Oregon Garden in Aurora, in Silverton, I should say. Some fall bulbs towards the end of the year. This is autumn daffodil, or Sternbergia lutea, and very pretty little yellow blooming bulb for October and into early November. This is an unusual shrub for late summer. This is a shrubby hare's ear is the name. I don't know where the name comes from, but the genus is Buplurum. It's European in origin. It's in the carrot family, which is a very unusual thing for a woody plant. And then it produces these inflorescences of yellow flowers in late summer, which curiously enough are very attractive to bald-faced hornets. But that's not a reason to not plant it. You know, it just gives an effect that very few other plants do. Blooming, of course, on new wood and easily sheared to control its size in early spring. Another native plant to the coast anyway in Oregon, but creeping into the Willamette Valley is coyote brush or Baccharis pilularis. This is in the rose family, but it is an evergreen shrub, and the flowers lack the disc flowers, which are characteristic of asters and other plants in the aster family. It only has the, it lacks the ray flowers, it has the disc flowers. So the inflorescence just has the thing in the middle, but not the large showy ray flowers that a lot of asters will have. It has a very interesting aroma, and this will typically be in bloom in October into November, which one person described as a mix between hay and honey. So it's actually quite a nice fragrance for that time of the year. So these range in size from large rounded evergreen shrubs, which is most of the Oregon forms, to much more diminutive ground cover types, like this one, which is called Twin Peaks. These do have a reputation for being a little bit tender, these California cultivars, but there are, it seems like, more and more of these more prostrate and more garden-friendly forms becoming available. So these would make a good ground cover for that unirrigated situation. And then another very familiar plant for most of us is the strawberry tree, which is aptly named. This is a form up at the research station in Aurora, which is about 50 years old and is now about 15 feet tall and about 30 feet across. So not the plant for a small garden, but the good news is there are smaller forms out there, more compact forms, one called, I believe, Compacta. This may be the one. This is in Bush Park in Salem. And this is a photo taken in early November. And as you can see, it's in both flower and fruit, the fruit being the product of flowers from the previous blooming cycle, the previous winter. So it's named strawberry tree or strawberry bush for a good reason, because of the resemblance of those fruit for a strawberry, and reputedly edible, although I have to confess I have not tried. There are other dwarf forms out there as well. This is one called Elfin King, which is just much more diminutive, but again, fall and early winter blooming. And then lastly, I hope I'm on time since I failed to note what the time was. This is one of the grevilleas, which we did find to be relatively hardy for the Willamette Valley. And again, grevilleas are Australian plants for the most part. And that goes by the name of spider flower, this particular one, Grevillea victoriae. So it's quite a large evergreen shrub, which begins, like the chaparral currant, blooming in the earliest part of winter, maybe December, and has that long bloom period into the early part of spring. So it's called spider flower for the resemblance of the flower, vaguely, I guess, for a spider. These are the closed flowers, which are already showy because of their color, and these are the open ones. And again, if there's any bumblebees or other pollinators active when it's warm in the wintertime, or any hummingbirds in the neighborhood, they will definitely find this plant. So just a quick to finish up there. This is a little landscape planting we did in Monmouth. This is a abandoned waste area in the middle of a street in Monmouth. And so by careful selection of plants, we change it from this bluegrass infested wasteland into this over a couple of years. So no irrigation, no fertilizing, no nothing. So this is what one can do. So I will finish there, and I sincerely hope I'm on time. So I can stop screen sharing, I think, and take any questions. I really have no idea what the time is.
Thanks, Neil. That was a wonderful presentation. I loved all those gorgeous photos and all your wonderful descriptions. So I'm going to turn it over to Sharon now for, I know there's some Q&As in the Q&A box, and Neil has said that he would be willing to stick around a little bit beyond the hour to answer some questions. So put any Q's and A's in questions in there.
Yeah. That was wonderful, and is generating questions. Early on, someone asked kind of about philosophies of using using beds. They said that here in the Pacific Northwest, we use raised beds in large part for drainage, but they had heard that in the Southwest, plants are often put down into troughs where water will collect with the high sides blocking the wind. And they're wondering whether you see here in the Willamette Valley that will begin to change our kind of bedding systems, I think reflecting the change in our weather.
Well, I would say a raised bed is it's kind of like a variation on a container in that it will tend to dry out more quickly than will a plant on level ground. The trough idea is very interesting. I mean, of course, we don't do that or have not done that. As long as the drainage is good, I mean, it will protect the soil in the trough somewhat, I guess, from the direct rays of the sun. But I mean, you can accomplish more or less the same goal by use of a mulch, be that a organic mulch that's added, or by ensuring the soil is covered up with foliage. So, I mean, I think that's an interesting technique, which has obviously evolved from necessity. But I guess it would be worth a try, but I think there are other ways to accomplish the same thing with level ground. But I will say containers, the ones I showed you on our patio, those things need regular water. A raised bed, just because the sides are exposed, will tend to warm up and as a result of that dry out a little bit more rapidly than will soil on the level ground. I hope that answered the question. It introduced a very interesting concept I hadn't heard of.
The next question gets at another problem. In addition to water availability, they're asking which of the plants you've covered in this session are deer resistant. So I'm wondering, do you have lists of plants that kind of are drought tolerant and deer resistant?
Well, I've seen a lot of deer resistant plant lists, and I've seen a lot of things on deer resistant plant lists that I don't think are terribly deer resistant. I would say, I mean, the problem is that not deer are all the same, and they're also opportunistic, and they're curious. So for all those reasons, they may sample something that, unbeknownst to them, was supposed to be on a deer resistant plant list. But if I had to put together a deer resistant plant list, I would trend towards things that were very aromatic, which they don't seem to want to dine on. Even things which have very thorny, thick, tough leaves, they don't mind. I mean, they'll feed on stuff like that. And you know, sometimes I see rock roses on deer resistant plant lists, but I've seen them graze on rock roses to the point where they defoliate part of the plant. But there are more aromatic rock roses, which might deserve a place on a deer resistant plant list. But I think that's the only characteristic I've seen, which I would say more or less consistently conveyed deer resistance. That's the only thing. If it's the more aromatic it is, the less likely they are to want to feed on it. And I could be wrong. If you have examples, by all means, put them in the chat.
Thank you. We have a question about finding plants. Somebody is asking if there's if you have any tips on where a gardener in the Willamette Valley can procure non-nursery standard ceanothus varieties. So they're looking for species besides Thriciofolius or gloriosus, kind of interested more in like Velutinus, something called snowbush. Yes, absolutely. That's all over the Cascades, for instance. When you go up in the Cascades in April, that's what you see in bloom up there. Is that sort of it's flat, probably because they get crushed under snow. But you know, Ceanothus velutinus also occurs in the Willamette Valley, but as this gigantic, along with Ceanothus sanguineus, is a huge shrub. You see them, but they're very rare. I don't discuss it because there's only so much time.
But the volutinous that you probably are most familiar with is when you drive over the Santiam Pass or wherever, and it can be found up in the Cascades. And I believe there are different subspecies in the Cascades versus the Willamette Valley. So a native plant nursery, of course, is going to be the go-to place for any of those. The Native Plant Society, you know, would be a good place to start, just an inquiry about where you could find anything that you're having trouble locating. I'm sure they have a Q&A service available there and might be able to recommend individual nurseries. I honestly can't give you that information. There is a website which isn't really being maintained, and it's not without its issues, but it's called Plant Native, and it provides lists of native plant nurseries in the Willamette Valley and elsewhere. So that's an option, I guess, as far as finding nurseries. But honestly, sometimes it's just a matter of Googling the plant name and then seeing what pops up. And often it will be associated, if it's rare, with a specific nursery. And it might even be one in this area. But we have an abundance of amazing retail and mail order nurseries right in Western Oregon. And I would say everything I mentioned is available within from a nursery within the Willamette Valley. Everything.
Well, great. Early on, you talked about your lawn, and that's prompted someone to ask, what type of grass do you recommend then if you're going to be trying to doing drought-tolerant lawns?
Well, I'm certainly no expert on lawns. There's some really good publications on the Extension publication website, which would give better detail than I can. Our lawn is, it started out as a mix of perennial rye and Achillea. Achillea, the common name of which is having a mental block here. Anyway, the idea was that it was a little more drought tolerant than perennial rye and would sort of form an eco lawn. Well, there's not a whole lot of the Achillea left, but there is more English daisy in there and clover. And so, I mean, that mix is relatively drought tolerant, only requires water every 10 days to 2 weeks during the period from, say, late July through mid-September, and it will jump right back when it starts to rain in October. Tall fescue is apparently the species of turf which is growable around here. In other words, it's disease resistant and adapted to the climate, which is most drought tolerant. But it's a coarser grass, and so some people find that a little bit objectionable in terms of its appearance compared to something like a perennial rye or a fescue or something of that nature. But you can grow probably any turf grass, you know, again, ones that's suited to Willamette Valley. It needs to be disease resistant to grow in the Willamette Valley without regular irrigation. If you're prepared to deal with the fact that it'll go brown, but you will, in some cases, want to water it just every now and then, just to keep those crowns alive and ready for when it starts to rain in the fall.
All right, thank you. Somebody has asked whether or not with all the various plants that you've shown today, did you notice any of these suffer in a significant way during the recent winter ice storm?
No, I'm thinking of them all. Anything evergreen, I have to tell you, is going to be vulnerable to wet snow or freezing rain, which is even worse. So, have I seen damage in the past? Yes, on Manzanitas, for instance. And so it can happen. Any evergreen woody shrub is a little bit at risk in the Willamette Valley. I didn't mention it. I also grow a cultivar of rock rose. It's Cystis Purpureus, and it's an upright growing form, and it kind of got a little bent over. So anything that's like that's got a habit like that and is evergreen is always going to be vulnerable to stuff like that. And so its habit has been altered a little bit, but I think with a little bit of pruning after bloom, it will probably be fine by midsummer. But the ones I mentioned, other than that, I think are probably pretty safe. They're either so low growing or deciduous. Not that deciduousness would have protected you against the ice storm we had. That, you know, the damage was minimal to nothing. But you raise a good point.
I think we probably have time for maybe 2 more questions.
We've got a number of questions asking for recommendations, such as, can you recommend drought-tolerant plants for shade or part shade?
That's a creature unto itself. Of course, we mentioned sweet box, which is it's almost like an obligate shade requiring plant because it doesn't seem to want to grow in sun. I believe there's a good a book out there. It's from specifically called Plants for Shade, but I'm afraid I don't have it here. It's in my office in Salem. But it deals specifically with, I think it's Plants for Dry Shade is the name of the book. And now I'm struggling to remember the exact title and the author. If you Google that, it may bring up the name of the book. But yes, dry shade is one of the toughest places in which to garden.
I think it's called Planting the Dry Shade Garden by Graham Rice.
That's the one. Yes, exactly.
Planting the Dry Shade Garden.
Juliet just saved me. Thank you. Yeah, so the dry shade garden is, I don't envy those of you who are dealing with dry shade. There's some places in our garden which have dry shade. What I will say though is that we have a nice combination of sweet box and star jasmine in dry shade on the north side of our house. And it does wonderfully, and they bloom at, you know, months apart, and they're both fragrant. But we don't deal with many spaces like that in our garden. So I can't offer much in the way of advice. That book is a good guide.
And I'll mention to everyone, some of you have been adding in the chat some local nurseries that people might want to look at for some of the plants that have been asked about. And Jet just put up a link to a dry garden website. So yes, we had a number of questions about dry shade, shade under large trees. Got one last question that kind of, I think, really gets to establishing plants where you eventually want it to be drought tolerant. So someone has been planting Cystis sunset, and they say every time they plant it, it dies. They have full sun, good drainage and soil. So they're really wondering about how much drip irrigation to use for the first year. How do you get enough water to your plants to really establish them for drought tolerance?
I just use a long hose and a good water wand. To be honest with you, it's very low tech, no science whatsoever. But I've also taken to planting more in the fall, which gets me out of that altogether. Did I hear that the plants which are failing are near large? Remember, we
sorry, I was mixing 2 questions together, and I didn't mean to do this. This is just an example of somebody who is planting Cystis sunset, and they're buying 1 gallon size. They plant it, they feel it's in a good place, and it's just not establishing. They said it has died every time. So they're wondering how to get enough water to it. They're using drip irrigation.
Well, maybe it isn't. I don't know. It's hard to comment, but maybe it isn't too little water. Maybe it's too much water. Maybe it's more of a soil-related drainage problem or something of that nature. It's a pretty robust plant, and it's very drought tolerant. And if it's receiving drip irrigation, then I mean, realistically, it wouldn't need any irrigation. But as long as the drainage was good, that it really should establish and grow with that level of summer watering. So it's hard to say more than that. I'm not sure. Again, these plants do require good drainage, as overused as that term actually is.
All right. Well, thank you. I think actually that gets us through the questions.
Well, good.
All right. Well, thank you, Sharon, for handling that. And thank you, Neil, so much for speaking to us tonight on this really interesting subject of drought tolerant plants.
My pleasure.
So, yes, we really appreciate your expertise on this subject, which I know you have lots of.
Well,
So
thank
for
you.
April, I want to let people know that April 20th, our next seminar, monthly seminar, will be on lichens. So hopefully you will join us back here on Zoom on April 20th.